The federal government is proposing several legislative changes to streamline the review process for major projects. Proposed reforms include streamlining federal involvement in project reviews, broadening cabinet power to accelerate certain projects, an overhaul of the Indigenous consultation process, and creating economic zones to potentially bypass existing laws. Now, these changes would see energy projects like pipelines reviewed and approved within a year. Environmental groups, as well as former Liberal Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault, have expressed concerns over the planned changes. And Steven Guilbeault joins me now. Steven Guilbeault, good to see you again. Thank you for being here today, sir.
My pleasure, David.
You said on Friday the government was using a sledgehammer in its approach to the regulations where a scalpel was needed. Well, what is it smashing with this metaphorical mallet, in your view?
So the first thing I should say, David, is that I agree with the government's goal that we can and should do better when it comes to approving projects and doing things like, assessing the impacts on human health and the environment of proposed projects. There's no debate there. As Environment Minister, there's a lot of things, many of the things that are proposed there that I tried to start putting in place. So there's no disagreement there. Where I think there is disagreement is on some of the elements that are being proposed there, and I would basically name three quickly for you.
Okay.
The fact that if this goes forward, it's a discussion paper, so we'll have to see, but the federal government would only assess projects that are offshore oil and gas, interprovincial like transmission lines or pipelines, but we'll come back on pipelines in a second, and nuclear projects. Everything else is now delegated to provinces, those provinces that have the ability to do it. And even in the case of pipelines, the Impact Assessment Agency wouldn't be responsible to assess the impacts of pipelines, but we would give this to the Canadian Energy Regulator, which has no experience doing that and is certainly not equipped to do that. We're proposing to create economic zones where projects would be pre-approved even before we've been able to assess them. That's going very, very far. And the third one is this thing called the jeopardy test. That's one of the fundamental elements of our Species at Risk Act and Species at Risk Protection. If a project jeopardizes the survival of a species, we don't go ahead with that. We won't sacrifice a specific species, whether it's an animal or vegetable species, for one single project. Now we're giving the capacity to the cabinet to subtract a project or projects from that test. And we're saying we'll use a high bar in terms of criteria. We have no idea what those criteria are. So those three elements are going much further than anything we've seen in Canada in terms of repealing elements of impact assessment.
Okay, those are the three big areas that jumped out to me as well. So this is good that we can sort of go through them. And when you talk about only assess projects that are essentially either multi-jurisdictional or shared jurisdictional, like offshore oil, for example, with the Atlantic Accords and things, the promise has been to move to one project, one review. So essentially now the provincial governments take sole ownership of anything that was within their territory, is how this is going to be. And not every province has the same standard, right? So there's an inconsistent sort of patchwork applied here. Yes. If there was a harmonization of standards, could that alleviate your concern? Because otherwise it can be a race to the bottom, essentially.
And unfortunately, this is what we're seeing. We've seen a number of provinces lower the bar in terms of their assessment of projects. We've seen that in Alberta, we've seen that in Saskatchewan, we've seen that in Ontario. There's a proposal to, we haven't seen it exactly, but in Quebec as well, that could achieve or lead to a less ambitious impact assessment in the province as well. So, historically, the federal government has tended to serve as this national standard. And I'm certainly not opposed to this idea of, one project, one assessment. When I was Environment Minister, we had an agreement with British Columbia to do that. I think, this is one of the things where I agree, but we need to make sure that we adhere to a certain national standard so that there isn't this discrepancy where, some provinces could say, well, our regime is more ambitious than the regime next door. How's that fair? And what's the role of the federal government? If we're saying, well, actually, federal government's no longer interested in doing that's a problem to me.
Okay, so but on pipelines, you mentioned already it goes from the Impact Assessment Agency to the Canada Energy Regulator, which is a different type of organization which doesn't look at the whole human and social and environmental impacts necessarily. But also they're proposing to give Cabinet pretty extraordinary powers here that when a pipeline is deemed to be in the public interest with lengthy routes to reduce risk and cost for investors, the approval decision could be made at the beginning before the energy regulator completes its review of conditions and routing details. That's giving it a green light before full study is done, is it not?
Yes, and you may recall that in the case that went all the way to the Supreme Court on impact assessment, a court case that was brought on by provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta and others, the Supreme Court said that the so-called Bill 69 was in part unconstitutional because basically of two reasons. One, this idea of national interest. The Supreme Court said, well, what's the national interest? You don't define what it is. We have no common, agreed, accepted definition of what the national interest is, so it's way too vague. And it also said that in its original inception, Bill C-69 gave too much discretionary power to the Minister of the Environment. And those powers were about here. And what we're proposing to give in this discussion document to either ministers or cabinet ministers is here in terms of discretionary power. It is hard to see how this legislation, if this is what comes to, if we come to that, how this would not be challenged in front of the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And based on that Supreme Court decision, it is difficult to see how such a legislation would not be struck down as being unconstitutional by the Supreme Court yet again.
You went over the jeopardy test for species at risk, that essentially it was a veto on a project in the past. Now it can be approved with a high bar by cabinet in limited circumstances. So we'll need to see what that bar is, I suppose, because that is going to be a big one.
What are those limited circumstances? What is this high bar? Again, what is the national interest? Because we say we could do that in a national interest. This is a lot of discretionary power that we're putting in the hands of ministers or cabinet. And I simply don't think that our tribunals will accept that. In a country like Canada, we need to have better processes and more transparency when it comes to decision making on important issues like these ones.
The economic zones. This is something Doug Ford has suggested in Ontario that would essentially allow for broad exemptions from provincial legislation in specific areas. I think he notably points to places like the Ring of Fire. There's been no technical briefing on this, and no one from the government is doing interviews, so it's hard to know exactly what they mean here. But they talk about areas where projects will be considered pre-approved, and these zones would cover areas like transportation corridors, telecommunication networks, energy production and transmission, and industrial regions. If you've got a highway and you want to put a power line by it, you probably don't need to do much work. If you've got a pipeline and you want to run wire in so you don't have to flare gas to do oil production, maybe you don't need a big assessment. But industrial region is broad. I mean, do you have a good sense of what the limits and constraints are on this? Because it isn't clear in what we've seen.
No, I don't. I don't think we do at this point. It is, again, very, very broad. I mean, if you're talking about interprovincial projects, you're talking about energy projects, you're talking about industrial zones. I mean, that sounds to me like it could cover a large part of our country where we could define those zones as economic zones and exempt project for impact assessment. I mean, my fear, David, I think that I agree with the government that we want many of these projects. I may disagree with some of them, but there are many of those projects that I and many others agree with. But by trying to go too fast and by trying to, people need to have confidence in our processes in a society like ours. And if people don't have trust in our processes, what's going to happen is exactly what happened under Prime Minister Harper, is that local communities, indigenous organizations, environmental groups are going to turn to the tribunals because they won't trust the process. And we will end up in the same situation where those projects, many of which that I would like to see move forward, will be bogged down in litigations, in local opposition, and in some instances maybe national opposition, and we won't be able to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves.
Right. So based on sort of you have a mixed review of this, right? And that you broadly like where they're going. You have a lot of questions and concerns about some of the measures. So I'm reading right. This is not another fracture point. Like you're still a Liberal, you're still a Liberal MP, you're comfortable. I have to ask because a lot of people will wonder, because this is a big departure in certain areas from the path we've seen for the past 10 years.
Yes, and in fact, I mean, if all of the elements that are in the discussion paper, because it is a discussion paper, are put forward into what would be a bill that would have to implement many of these things, it would take us back decades in terms of being able to understand what the impacts of these projects are on human health, on the environment. Since it is a discussion paper, I'm hoping that the government will be listening to what experts have to say, to what people who've been in this field for decades have to say, to ensure that our objectives can meet. And I think there is a possibility to do that. And I guess my appeal to the government is please listen to what people will have to say in those 30 days of consultation.
But if legislation comes that mirrors this, as it is written in the discussion paper, it strikes me that would be very difficult for you to vote for.
I've learned a few things since I've been in politics. One of them is to try and avoid answering hypothetical questions. So maybe you and I can agree that we'll have another conversation about this if and when legislation is tabled.
Right, but you know how everyone is going to view that sort of response there. I
mean, I really want to see what the end process will look like, or maybe we will have more information in the coming weeks by different ministers that would be responsible of implementing some of these elements. But right now it's a bit difficult. I mean, it is a discussion paper, so I think let's give the government a chance to perhaps further explain what they have in mind, and then we'll be in a better position to assess, how good or not good these proposals are.
Okay, I've gone over time, Minister, but I'm sorry, Mr. Guilbeault, old habit, I apologize. We're getting near the end point, it seems, on the MOU discussion between Alberta and the federal government. Daniel Smith was on the show Friday and said there's a meeting of the minds. We're just in the final drafting of language. We could even see something this week. What are your concerns? Because I know this was a big reason why you left the federal cabinet. What are your concerns that you see that they have apparently found common ground? I mean, what would be the thing you're most worried you could see in the MOU when and if it comes this week?
I published an op-ed in the Toronto Star a few weeks ago expressing some of those concerns. I'm obviously not against the idea of signing an agreement with Alberta on many of these things. I think what is important is that we ensure that some of the commitments we've made on things like carbon pricing in Budget 2025, we said that we would continue increasing pricing post-2030, and we know that if we want to get effective transition in the industrial sector, the price needs to be higher. We need to keep the clean electricity regulations because it will ensure we decarbonize the electricity sector, which is at the heart of everything we will be doing in the coming years. More and more industries will run on electricity. Our transportation will run more and more on electricity. Our buildings. If we don't decarbonize this, we can't decarbonize society. So these are the sort of things I will be looking for in a perhaps announcement this week on the MOU with Alberta.
Steven Guilbeault, we always appreciate the time. Thanks for being here, sir, and we will hold you to that. If we see legislation, we're going to invite you back. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
The federal government is hoping to fast-track the approval of major projects, including pipelines, and it has proposed legislative changes aimed at completing review processes within a year. Now, this has prompted pushback from environmental groups and a former Liberal environment minister. Earlier in the show, I asked Steven Guilbeault why he says these changes are risky.
My fear, David, I think that I agree with the government that we want many of these projects. I may disagree with some of them, but there are many of those projects that I and many others agree with. But by trying to go too fast, and by trying to, people need to have confidence in our processes in a society like ours. And if people don't have trust in our processes, what's going to happen is exactly what happened under Prime Minister Harper, is that local communities, Indigenous organizations, environmental groups are going to turn to the tribunals, right, because they won't trust the process. And we will end up in the same situation where those projects, many of which that I would like to see move forward, will be bogged down.
This and a few other stories. We've got Vandana Cotter. She was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Brad Levine is a former national campaign director for the NDP. And here with me in the studio is Kate Harrison, who's a conservative political analyst, and Rob Russo, who is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. Good to see you all. Vandana, the call there is coming from inside the House with Steven Guilbeault at one point saying, remember that court case we lost because we gave ministers too much power? Well, this seeks to go even beyond that. And he is worried this is going to end up being slowed down in the courts. What do you make of that sort of pushback from a Liberal MP?
Yeah, I think what he said, I understand his perspective in the sense that people are worried about processes. And I think what he's talking about is that there are people who care a lot about the environment, and they are going to be worried. And while we know there's a different situation happening now than 10 years ago, we look what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, look what's happening around the world, and potentially a national unity crisis, that give and take will have to be done. But can people trust the process? And I think if people feel like they can trust the process and that it's transparent, they'll feel comfortable that we accept at this time we had to have give and take. But I think he just wants to make clarity to the government that we make sure that that process is something that can be amenable for a number of people who would be worried about this.
Brad, what do you make of this, right? Like, I understand all of those considerations, but this is legislation potentially to change the rules forever, and it goes beyond C5. It applies to everything, major project or not, and there's a whole lot of steps being skipped and power being granted potentially to ministers.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the important things to acknowledge is the timing. We're at an era where the environment has been slipping subsequently since the 2019 election, when the environment and climate change were top of mind issues. Today, it is well behind things like economic security, jobs, rate of inflation, cost of living, those kinds of things. So it'll be interesting to see if the government today has the ability to kind of override environmental standards in order for the promise of economic activity. I think that's the first thing. Second thing is this notion of what the minister was saying about Canadians have faith in processes.
Right.
I think we've also been watching a steady decline in people's trust in institutions. We've seen it, with large institutions, with things like corporations or governments. The ability to get things done, I think, is one. I don't know. I maybe push back ever so respectfully on this idea that Canadians buy into the current processes. I think there's a lot of frustration in this country. Not only, I think it's polarized. I think you're going to see an entrenched notion that people want to see the environment protected at all costs and no projects. And at the same time, I think you're going to see a lot of Canadians saying it's time we get on with some things. And I think, obviously this is all tainted not only because of the economic uncertainty, but, I think Trump has brought a lot of this on there. So I think that, it'll be interesting to see whether the country gives this government, and in particular this Prime Minister, some license to do that. Where I think it's going to get interesting is when you see that one window where the provinces now have kind of an override on what the standards will be, when we look at bordering provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, who share natural resources like natural gas. You allow Alberta to have one set of standards and BC another, we're going to see potentially a race to the bottom, and that'll be an interesting discussion.
I mean, Kate, look, I think there is a national consensus broadly to speed up timelines, right? I don't think there's a disagreement on that, but it's how you calibrate that and finding a balance and not swinging it too far in one way. And I just look at some of the things here, and how this is used is going to matter. When it comes to a big pipeline that crosses multiple jurisdictions on a long route, to reduce risks and costs for investors, the decision to greenlight it could be made at the beginning of the decision process before the Canada Energy Regulator completes its review of conditions and routing details. So Cabinet could give it a yes before there's even an analysis of the route. If you flip that around and say they could give it a no for environmental reasons before any economic analysis was done, you know, that would be a problem that way. This
Yeah.
is quite the power to give cabinet.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that industry is necessarily asking for more ministerial power and oversight. They are, to your point, David, asking for faster timelines and for the process to be sped up. But the insertion of ministerial power is an insertion of politics. And politics ultimately for industry creates risk. And so I am not sure that the powers that are granted or that are proposed to be granted here are necessarily going to give the signal to industry that they need to make decisions with confidence and certainty.
But it sounds like it's giving cabinet the power to say, yep, you can build that pipeline while we work through the technical stuff and we'll deal with any issues if they come up.
That seems to be the case for now. I would just observe that part of the reason why infrastructure is not built in this country is, yes, because of poor timelines, but also because of political uncertainty and the environment there. And I think having more of that in the process, as opposed to dealing with some of the foundational and systemic issues around bad energy laws, that would be a more appropriate signal that I think industry is calling for than the insertion of more ministerial oversight.
Well, I mean, Rob, there's a lot of ministerial beef to this, right? The Minister of Environment can just impact assessment conditions in exceptional circumstances. The Minister of One Canada Economy, which would be LeBlanc, can adjust environmental conditions, which is interesting, that the non-environment minister can adjust environmental conditions. But they're also giving the cabinet limited power with a high threshold, but not defined and not explained, to exempt specific projects from the application of the jeopardy test for species at risk. This is the test that if a project is going to wipe out or severely limit the population of an endangered species, an animal or vegetation, the project can't go ahead. They're going to give them the right to say, no, go ahead and do it because we think it's in the economic interest. This is a coalition challenge, potentially, depending where they go with this for some of the Liberal base.
Yes, although it depends on how you define the Liberal coalition. Up until now, it's everybody. Everybody's in the Liberal coalition these days.
For the last 10 years, though. Yeah.
It's interesting. This story was broken by Althea Rajat, the Toronto Star, who did an interview with Mr. Guilbeault in which he said that so far Mr. Carney appears to be going even further, or he's worse than Stephen Harper. And normally these would be fighting words for most Liberals. I'm not sure that it is for Mark Carney. About a year before he ran, I had an interview with him, and I asked him who his leaders are that he most respected and admired. One of them was Jean Chrétien. The other one was Stephen Harper. And Pope Francis was the third, for those keeping score. An interesting triumvirate. So normally that would be a kind of a fighting word or an epithet if you called a Liberal a Stephen Harper Liberal. I don't think it is for Mark Carney, number one. And number two, it's interesting that Mr. Guilbeault is doing this while staying in the caucus. I don't hear anybody else in cabinet, although there are people who have concerns, nobody else in cabinet is making these kinds of noises. I think the cabinet has bought into what was reflected in a poll released by the Canadian Press today, and I believe it was an Angus Reid poll that showed substantially more support for economic growth over the environment.
Sure.
It's people are worried about jobs, and so that's being reflected in that. But there are others who feel like Mr. Guilbeault does in that caucus. They're watching, they are concerned, but they also acknowledge that the Prime Minister's approval ratings are 60% plus these days, and now is not the time to have this discussion. He's doing it, and he's doing it within the confines of caucus. A question I might have for Mr. Guilbeault is, are there red lines? Are you prepared to leave?
Well,
or do you want to get shoved out?
I did ask him that, and he said, I'm not going to answer a hypothetical. He wants to see where this, because this is a discussion paper, he wants to see where the legislation comes back. But it's very clear to me he could not vote for legislation that implements this word for word as it is written.
Right.
Right?
And so there are bridges too far. Another one for members of the Liberal caucus that I've spoken to is if there was a Northern Gateway-style pipeline that did not have significant Indigenous support, that would be another red line for a lot of them.
Right.
But we aren't there yet, and they're still working on Indigenous support.
Okay, but Vandana, how is this bigger than Steven Guilbeault? Do you think there's a greater level of discomfort? Because, you know, I know it's the new government, as they like to say, a lot of holdovers from the old government who used to say the environment and the economy go hand in hand, and this legislation seems to say the environment, it gets in the way a lot.
Yeah, I think, my learnings from government is that there's no best choice, there's just choices, right? And I think at this point, the Prime Minister is faced with choices about how do I make investors happy? How do I attract FDI? How do I make sure that we actually build in this country? How do I look credible with that? I do think he cares about the environment, but I think we're also looking at a number of issues. And again, I mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, the national unity crisis. I think a lot of caucus members can understand that. Some caucus members will feel uncomfortable, but I think they feel comfort that Mark Carney still has a number of ideas for the environment, but also that we're also behind on environmental infrastructure. Like if everyone can afford an EV and every rural area had charging stations, you can look, and we are at different places with clean energy, like you can look at other options too. Not that we still won't be doing that, but I think really is that I think for the most part, caucus will stay together. I think there's still time for discussion with caucus on this, so we'll have to see what happens through legislation. But I think for the most part, people feel that Canadians, Guilbeault talked about what's in the national interest. And I think that's shifted over the last 10 years. And I think right now, majority of Canadians feel like it's in their national interest just to focus solely on the economy and make sure that investors are comfortable, make sure we have jobs here, and make sure we have the ability to build those jobs in Canada.
But Brad, and I take the point on what is catalyzing this moment, right, to borrow a phrase, and on the popularity of the Prime Minister in support of the government. But you got to look at the actions, I always feel, in isolation from the polling numbers of the actor. And the potential consequences of this is that it is going to be a bridge too far for some of the progressives who voted liberal the last number of elections or serve as liberals since the last election, because it goes even beyond the limited scope. As extraordinary as those powers were in C5, this is a much broader framework that they are potentially putting into law here.
Yeah, now I know why Daniel Smith was meeting with the Prime Minister out of the blue on Friday. It all becomes clear on Mondays, doesn't it? This is why the Monday panel is among the finest of the various panels.
Do we have polling on that? But anyway, keep going.
Well, we can do a quick survey of the table now. As soon as I was listening to the minister speak, or the former minister speak, I was wondering, is this the beginning of the fraying of the coalition? We've talked a lot about how big can the tent be and for how long. And we've seen how large it can get. You've got somebody like Steven Guilbeault, and then you've got former very conservative MPs crossing the floor to join this wartime-like cabinet. But then eventually the rubber's got to hit the road, and there's got to be policies whereby some of these more progressive Liberal MPs will sit there and say no. I think it depends. If they would bolt, it depends on where they are in their career trajectory, whether they're currently in cabinet, whether they're in the backbench, whether their constituents like what the Prime Minister is doing or not. Because I think there's an understanding, I think, by the PMO that they can do things today that the PMO could not do, even if it wanted to, a handful of years ago. I think there's a sense of leeway that Carney is getting, not only because of his background and his experience, but because of where things are right now in the state of the economy. We have 3 years more of Trump. We have economic insecurity. We have a cost of living crisis. And right now, what he's setting up is, I can take more space in the power dynamic of getting big projects done, because that seems to be a big frustration among the investor class. That seems to be a frustration among some premiers, and that seems to be some frustration among companies that want to expand and invest in Canada. So I think he's seizing the opportunity of where he is now and taking the space up. Whether the arguments of 2019 and Mr. Guilbeault, 2 words, David, that we haven't heard of in the last little while: Paris targets. We're not hearing any commitment.
That's because they're dead.
Yeah,
that's because they're dead. May they rest in peace.
Any GHG, anything about the environment, anything about targets about that environment are long gone and no longer part of the conversation. He ran on and said he wants to move things at the speed that we've never seen before. And so we'll see if there's a tolerance among the population to say we can take more power away from other entities, gives more power to the premiers and more power to this cabinet. We'll see who fights back. Other than the environmental movement, we'll see where the Indigenous community goes.
Yeah, and the AFN is looking at it, may have something to say. So, Kate, quick word on that. I want to move to the next topic.
Giving yourself more power or the ability to use power is not necessarily using that power.
No, I get it. Yep.
So, we're having this conversation about the political risk that the Prime Minister is taking on in terms of whether or not, of giving himself these powers. We're still removed from whether or not they would actually be used.
They are going to pull out, though, of reviewing projects that are entirely within one province, right? Like, so they are down, so that is it, they're pulling away. That's an absence, right?
But I would observe that the consultation that is happening now in terms of engaging on these projects really ultimately is tinkering with the margins. The consultation has happened over the course of the last 10 years. Energy projects are not getting built in this country. I don't know how much more consultation and engagement is needed for industry to tell you the same thing that they've been telling you for about the last decade, which is that you need to get on top of removing these energy laws, not necessarily giving ministers more political authorities.
No, look, I know, but like 2 years ago, a bunch of the oil companies wrote a letter saying we believe in industrial carbon pricing, and now they're saying let's get rid of industrial carbon pricing, right? So like there has been shifts and changes
as so
right?
too has changed the world. There's very few countries that are now looking at onboarding an industrial carbon price, oil-producing countries.
Look, maybe it'll be fine, maybe it won't be. A technical briefing on this would be much appreciated, as would interviews with members of the government, but here we are.